The debate around data centers across the country, teachers' strikes amid the states, and America's talking with clips from across the nation. Plus, Illinois in focus. This is the Center Square Daily for Tuesday, March 10th, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. The debate around data centers sweeping across the country, with costs and energy concerns topping the minds of taxpayers and ratepayers. And this is obviously a debate that's going to increase with the ongoing construction and development of artificial intelligence and the amount of data that's going to be needed there, but also the amount of energy and other natural resources being used to cool data centers and store power for data centers. But a recent poll out of Wisconsin shows 70% of voters say the cost of data centers outweighs the benefits. At thecentersquare.com, you can also read about Florida looking to prohibit government agencies from signing non-disclosures with large load customers. Plus, in Michigan, there's a bipartisan proposal to halt construction of all new data centers. In New York, green groups are urging the governor there to have a 3-year ban on new data centers. And in Georgia, the Senate passed a bill ending tax breaks for data centers. A collection of different types of coalitions joining together to stand up and fight against what they see as a lot of money of taxpayer subsidies or tax breaks with little actual benefit, plus the demand on energy. Now, some other stories you'll find across the country at the Center Square talking about data centers and the cost of energy in this equation. In Washington State, Carlene Johnson reports Puget Sound Energy asking the Washington Utilities and Transportation Committee to approve its plan to increase its electric bill rates by nearly 30% and gas bills for nearly 20% by 2029 for residential ratepayers. Data center construction, to keep up with the energy-hungry demands of artificial intelligence, is also putting strain on that system. Now, a bill was moving rapidly through the legislature seeking to hold data centers accountable, placing the burden on securing resources on operators of those facilities. Mary Dye, a Washington legislator, warning about what's to come for ratepayers.
And so they anticipate they will need at least 2,000 to 3,000 miles of new transmission to bring all that unreliable energy to market in the Puget Sound. So if you think this doesn't make sense, you're right. It doesn't make sense.
The reliability of energy, a major concern amongst ratepayers, as some states are moving towards so-called renewable energy like wind and solar and even battery storage. In Virginia, the Center Square's Charlene Guerrera reports lawmakers examining infrastructure demands tied to Virginia's expanding data center industry, including electricity and water usage to cool large computing facilities. Virginia, particularly Northern Virginia, hosts the largest concentration of data centers in the world. A joint legislative audit and review commission reports in Virginia also suggests lawmakers consider allowing local governments to require data centers develop to submit in water use estimates to the city and consider water demand when reviewing zoning and special use permit applications for data centers. The Center Square's Darren Svan reports in Louisiana, a Shreveport data center is in limbo. Stack Infrastructure moving forward with an Amazon-related development at 2 project sites near Shreveport and the city's planned data center. That's sitting in limbo amid civil litigation against the mayor and the city council. That legal action shifting priorities toward the rural centers, and contractors and vendors, they're exploring initial opportunities around early site build-outs for data centers, with additional meetings and even litigation continuing. A hearing scheduled March 23rd in the 1st Judicial District Court to consider dismissing that litigation. But at stake for Shreveport is the promise of sales tax revenue, more jobs, and substantial investment dollars. From the cost of energy because of data centers to the cost of teachers and education and the ability for those teacher unions to call a strike, let's now connect with the Center Square's education reporter, Esther Wickham. Esther, thanks for taking time. Fascinating story, especially seeing and comparing and contrasting the different states and how they handle labor stoppages with teachers. Tell us about your latest and the debate growing as states consider banning such activities.
Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing debate, especially how other states around the country respond and react to the various strikes that we've seen, not only with, labor unions demanding certain things when regarding their salary or their pay, but also with recent immigration enforcement and the continued student walkouts that we see. There's this question about, do the school districts support this? Are the teachers joining in? And so we're seeing around the country, there are strike bans or heavily restricted bans on teacher strikings in around, 37 to 38 states, including Washington, D.C. And, some states, we have Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia legislation that have explicit preventions for teachers to strike. And so there, are those specific states that say, we don't allow this. We want, these taxpayer funded jobs to be secured, and during the school day when they are doing what they should be doing, teaching their students, they're not, going out and protesting and striking and requesting more funds or whatever there is. And then looking over to other states, there are 12 states that explicitly allow teacher strikes. And it's no surprise that they are definitely more progressive states. We have Alaska, California, Colorado, Illinois, Louisiana, Minnesota, Montana, and you can see on the graphic there, the list goes on, and those specific states, have legislation that allow these strikes, and so the debate kind of continues about what should this look like on a national level.
We've seen in some larger municipalities as well, like Chicago, an example. I think they had like 3 or 4 strikes over the span of 5 years. Some of them happening amidst the ongoing pandemic. With the growing concerns of kids not being in the classroom, kids not getting the instruction they need, and a whole host of other concerns. When we think about, the taxpayer cost here, obviously teachers are getting paid and they have a union they may be part of, and that union brings to the table, we need increased pay for this, increased funding for continuing education, increased, funding for after school programs or whatever the case may be, or certain types of labor rules when it comes to the pandemic. That was a big thing. But while we're talking about the taxpayer cost, what do you think the cost is on, and are you seeing that concern of the impacts on children and their capability to learn?
Yeah, absolutely. Specifically in the state of Arizona, there is a new bill. That is one of the states that allows teacher strikes. There isn't any ban. And we're seeing, that raised concern, even on education in general. And there's been a ton of reporting out there, right? We're seeing because of the pandemic, because of school choice, because of just the public school system in general, there's concerns around our children learning, our teachers teaching, and the test scores are kind of proof and a result of that that's not necessarily happening. And so I don't think that's a direct result, but in Arizona, there's a new bill out there that would essentially prohibit public school teachers from striking or participating in organized work stoppages. And, this has definitely drawn a lot of criticism from union officials. And so the Center Square was able to talk to Geneva Fuentes, who is the communications director for the Arizona Education Association. And there's no surprise there. She's extremely against this bill, saying that this is going to have unintended consequences for school districts. And something that she heavily emphasizes is that specific legislation is poorly drafted and it withholds funds from school districts if educators want to speak to each other about, how they're being treated, if something, goes on. And so that is one of the consequences. There are threats of withholding funding, if teachers go on strike. And this union official is saying that this could impact the students if the teachers aren't allowed to go on strike.
Yeah, the union's role in this, I think, is something that obviously a lot of people are closely examining across the country, because unions, they say they're an assembly of people to fight for certain types of labor issues. But when you start looking at like state house races and the amount of political dollars that these unions are pouring into legislators' campaign coffers across the country, it really begs the question as to, what is the role of that union? Is it to negotiate fair contracts? Is it to play in politics? And then you've got, of course, the Janus case that actually came out of Illinois all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court prohibiting forcing public sector employees to be members of unions. So talk a bit about the union's impact here. And you'd mentioned earlier on, even down to the granular detail of students going out on protests and whether or not certain ideologies are being funneled into the schools through teachers, through their union.
Yeah, absolutely. The Center Square has reported a ton on how teacher unions, especially, the National Education Association or the American Federation for Teachers, these unions have a massive impact on public education. And, when you look at the membership dues, these, especially the NEA, they're making over, $390 million per year on membership dues. And you see this is technically heavily funded through taxpayers, right? Taxpayers are funding these teacher salaries. In a lot of the school districts, they don't necessarily pay for the membership dues, but they deduct the membership dues from these teacher salaries. And so these unions are being heavily supported via taxpayers. And we see that impact on a lot of teachers, on a lot of students. And just like you said, the rise of, concern for immigration enforcement, is it coming on school, property, a lot of student walkouts being scheduled, being planned. We're seeing that across the country, and it's not even, over the weekend or after school. This is during school. Their, classrooms are empty, students aren't learning, and there's a lot of concern around that. And we don't necessarily see that being addressed or that being a concern, for these unions necessarily. I've talked to a lot of other union members, and it seems that they're more concerned about, the funding. They don't want their funding withheld, and they want to protect students. I think that everyone across the board wants to keep children safe and protected and have them learn, but the way that they go about it is going to be a little bit different, and specifically going back to Arizona, the Center Square was able to talk to the superintendent there, Tom Horn, who is a huge advocate for this specific legislation to ban to ban teacher strikes. And his main thing is, he says, sure, it's First Amendment right for teachers to strike and their right to protest, but not during school hours, right? You're taxpayer funded. It's your First Amendment right to do that, but don't do it at an unreasonable hour. Make sure that these students are being taught, and their taxpayer funded salaries are being put to good use, and make sure that they're getting the education that they need, and focused on that rather than just polarizing and politicizing everything around them in the education system.
We're talking with Esther Wickham, the education reporter at thecentersquare.com. You can see her latest talking about the ongoing debate around whether or not teachers can strike. And it's interesting to see that roughly 38 states, including Washington, D.C., banning or heavily restricting that practice. And this may be a segment for a totally different day, but have we done any kind of comparison on those 38 states and education outcomes that either ban or restrict teachers walking off the job to those states that do allow for teachers to walk off the job?
Yeah, that's definitely something I would like to do for reporting in the future. Just really go line by line and look at every single state. An article can only be so long, and people's retention rate can only be so long. But in this specific, report, I did go through some of the states, other states like Texas and Maryland. Specifically in Texas, there was a lot of student walkouts and some criticism and concern from the Texas Education Agency that teachers or the administrators within the education school districts were kind of encouraging or incentivizing these students to do that. And so the TEA kind of issued guidance after these walkouts saying, hey, this is not okay for educators and for teachers to encourage students to leave the classroom for these protests. And we're going to, do an investigation into these school districts to see what exactly is going on. Because as we know, Texas is a more red state, and the attorney general there, released a statement saying, we don't want our Texas schools to be a breeding ground for radical left open border agenda, and they want their public school officials to be following the law and, not unlawfully facilitate student participation in protests that, as, they say is targeting heroic lawful government officials. And so, especially when we come to the ICE protests and the immigration enforcement protests, it's super political and it's very polarizing. And so it's like, okay, are these 15 and 16-year-olds actually out there protesting for something they believe, or are they being told something from
or are
their
they just looking to
teachers?
get out of class for the day, right? I mean, that's one thing
Yeah,
that
exactly.
I was always looking for when I was 13, 14, 15 years old. How can I get out of class today? Esther,
Exactly.
obviously there's tons of other issues that kind of traverse away from, reading, writing, and arithmetic and get into politics. And the union's involvement in that as well. I mean, we've seen it here in Illinois where they oppose school choice measures. And we've got this national bill that is allowing for states to opt into a school choice scholarship program. And we had a program like that in Illinois, but the teachers' unions seem to be instrumental in getting that measure to sunset here in the state of Illinois. So there's going to be plenty more for us to talk about in the future on this particular story of protests and unions and their involvement in education and educational outcomes. So greatly appreciate your time. Esther Wickham, the Center Square education reporter. We'll definitely connect again soon. And now it's time for America's Talking with clips from across the country. And we actually start with President Donald Trump yesterday, talking to officials and laying out what he wants to see done with the nation's elections.
All voters must show the act. Voter ID. Ready? This is not complicated. Voter identification. Now, if I have a whole list, but I don't want to put. I have like hundreds of things on the list. If you go shopping, if you do this, if you buy a car, if you license a car, if you point to everything you need to have identification. So all voters have to show identification, ID. All voters must show proof of citizenship in order to vote. So you have ID and you have citizenship. So far, good. No mail-in ballots except for illness, disability, military, or travel. Mail-in ballots are a disaster. And I put that down as a top 3. Look, no mail-in. Now you have the exceptions for the military, and I would even say foreign-based military. But for the military, for disability, for illness, and if you're traveling, you have an excuse. And I was lenient on that.
So the president pushing for Congress to enact the Save America Act, which would require voter ID, that only citizens vote in the election, and restrict mail-in balloting. Now, in Minnesota, there was a debate about provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are those that maybe the veracity of the voter hasn't been fully vetted, so it's held off separate from the count and vetted and then counted later. But House Bill 3845 in Minnesota says that certain voters who register on election day would be required to cast a provisional ballot. Here's Representative Ben Davis, a Republican, and Representative Emma Greenman, Democratic Farm Labor Party member, debating this issue on provisional ballots.
I love your bill. It adds a simple verification process without blocking votes or disenfranchising a voter who fills one out. It strengthens the integrity of our elections, which I am always a big thumbs up on. And I don't understand why the Secretary of State's office is always against us trying to do something with provisional ballot, because it also helps us align with HAVA's best practices.
My concern, particularly with this bill, and I think we've seen this before, is when I've seen provisional balloting bills in the past, they've had millions of dollars of fiscal notes that have to do with that changing, adding that maybe pile, adding the training, and the setting up the administration is actually what prevents people from being disenfranchised. There are states where a third to a half of provisional ballots are thrown out, and that is, if we did this, we wouldn't want to be one of those states.
Obviously, a debate that's going to continue in Minnesota around election integrity. Now, in Arizona, there was a bill about immigration enforcement in the Senate, Senate Bill 1213, ultimately passing some of the provisions. It says that notwithstanding any other law, if a person is an illegal alien who's unlawfully present in the United States and is convicted of a violation of law, the alien's not eligible for probation. It also goes further to essentially take the local governments and say they have to cooperate with federal immigration officials. The measure getting debated on the Arizona Senate floor between Democratic State Senator Catherine Miranda and Republican State Senator Janae Shamp.
We all know that the Constitution grants due process to all people under the 14th Amendment. SB 1213 is inherently unconstitutional, and the consequences of its passing would allow discrimination in the basis of national origin. This undermines our justice system. Due process and the right to a fair trial is a human right in the United States, not just of citizens. And I vote no.
This bill is extremely simple. The taxpayers do not want to pay, utilizing their hard-earned dollars to pay for illegal immigrants to be in our probation system. There's a need for this. It's a common sense bill ensuring that we are fiscally responsible for taxpayers' dollars and that we are protecting the citizens of the state of Arizona. And with that, I vote aye.
Debate around immigration enforcement across the country, with different states taking different approaches on whether to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. And then in Washington state, there was an amendment to a reproductive health funding bill, with Republican State Representative Matt Marshall looking to narrowly define what the state tax dollars could be used for, but that effort was rebuffed by Democratic State Representative Nicole Macri in Washington state.
This amendment refocuses the underlying policy on real healthcare needs rather than just building an abortion slush fund. By expanding the eligible organizations to include in vitro fertilization and other fertility providers, this amendment would require that at least half of the money put into this fund would go to providers that would be providing other reproductive services, not just abortion.
It is true that this legislature should and does support a range of reproductive health care services. Because of CMS guidance that basically said they don't need to segregate this for abortion care, we need a bill to make sure that our residents can have access to this essential health care. So please vote no on the amendment.
And ultimately, that amendment from Marshall being voted down. And finally, for America's Talking, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry Monday addressing the state legislature, laying out his priorities for that state. And here's just a little bit of his open.
You and I were elected to do things differently. The people wanted it that way. They begged for it. They begged us to reform systems that were no longer serving our people, to change the trajectory of an economy held back by tired policies, and to make unmistakably clear that the Louisiana government works for the taxpayers and that the taxpayers don't work for the government. After 4 special sessions and 2 regular sessions, I stand beside you to say that you have kept those promises. And I firmly believe that this legislature and my administration will be remembered for the promises that we have kept.
Now, one of the proposed bills that Landry has recommended is removing of judges, which would require 2/3 vote in the Senate. And this change would also require voter approval. Landry pitched the measure as a fiscally responsible way to try to reduce the teacher retirement debt and a variety of other issues, including the spending of taxpayer dollars for higher education. Those are some of the things that the Louisiana legislature is expected to tackle. And that is America's Talking, with clips from across the country here with the Center Square. I'm your host, Greg Bishop, and we'll be right back. And now it's time for Illinois in Focus with the Center Square Daily. I'm your host, Greg Bishop, and today at the Illinois Supreme Court in Springfield, a couple of different cases being debated in front of Supreme Court justices concerning Illinois' firearm owner's ID card. This is a card that's required by Illinois residents to be able to purchase and possess firearms and ammunition. And the card itself, several requirements. You've got a $10 fee, a recent picture, and a valid driver's license. And those things seem to be easy to obtain, and you can go get a valid FOID card to then be able to purchase firearms and ammunition. But there are some other provisions that Illinois State Police spell out in their rules, and the eligibility to get one of those FOID cards. Among those are you cannot be a convicted felon under the laws of any jurisdiction. State police also spelling out that you cannot be adjudicated a, quote, mental defective. Also, you can't be a mental patient in an institution for the past 5 years, not intellectually disabled or developmentally disabled in the past year, and also not addicted to certain substances, plus a whole host of others that you saw there in the graphic, spelling out who is eligible for a firearm owner ID card. Now, there have been several cases brought up to the Illinois Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of requiring somebody have a piece of identification provided by the state that allows you to purchase firearms and ammunition. As the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You can see the questions being raised by Second Amendment supporters that having a state-issued ID as a requirement to obtain a firearm is an infringement. We've seen multiple cases in front of the Illinois Supreme Court challenging this, but each time the Illinois Supreme Court's taking procedure to essentially remand cases back to the lower courts for them to deal with certain types of questions. Well, today, in front of the Illinois Supreme Court, they did hear a case concerning individuals who are challenging the FOID statute. And Elizabeth Cook, an assistant appellate defender for James Benson, she spelled out in her arguments in front of the Illinois Supreme Court that the FOID card does not match up with the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms.
Under the framework announced in Bruin and Rahimi, the burden is on the state to point to a historical analog that is similar in the same purpose and the same manner that it regulates firearm possession. Those people who are law-abiding definitely do have Second Amendment rights. But in fact, as we can see from the example set in Rahimi, the court considers all American citizens to have Second Amendment rights, and then will conduct the historical analysis to determine whether the regulation at issue is based in history and justified by the policies that would have motivated people at the time of the founding. Permanent prohibition on Benson's firearm possession with criminal penalties for violations based on a prior conviction for nonviolent conduct is incompatible with our nation's historical tradition and thus violated the Second Amendment as applied to him. The legislative scheme outlined in the FOID Card Act, a presumptive lifetime ban on firearm possession subject to inexact criteria and complete government discretion, has no historical analog.
Now, legal documents show that from a bench trial, James Benson was found guilty of 1 count of reckless discharge of a firearm, 1 count of unlawful use or possession of a weapon by a felon, and 1 count of misdemeanor domestic battery. Benson was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and the direct appeal from the judgment is what the court was taking up. No issue being raised about the charging instruments in that case, but the plaintiffs there, the defense in this case, saying that the recent rulings out of the U.S. Supreme Court are highlighting that in their arguments, the FOID card in Illinois is unconstitutional. But the state being represented by Garson Fisher as the Assistant Attorney General, he says that the U.S. Supreme Court has greenlit states like Illinois that have a similar type of identification process for gun owners.
Both Heller and then McDonald explicitly held that prohibitions against felons possessing firearms are constitutional. This court in Burns, relying on those opinions, reached the same conclusion. And that conclusion was actually reinforced in Bruin, when the court reaffirmed the holding of those earlier cases that the Second Amendment protects the rights of law-abiding citizens to possess firearms. Now, that category, law-abiding citizens, necessarily excludes all felons. Now, my friend says that the mechanism in the FOID Card Act itself is unconstitutional under Bruin, but Bruin is actually inapposite to that provision. What Bruin is talking about is the presumption that ordinary law-abiding citizens have a right to possess firearms. And in footnote 9, it recognized that shall-issue licensing regimes, including Illinois', are constitutional because they do presumptively allow law-abiding citizens to possess firearms.
Now, the Illinois Supreme Court took that case and a second case concerning Illinois' firearm owner ID card under advisement, which means it could be weeks to months before we find out how the Illinois Supreme Court rules on this. But you also have to consider other cases that are working through the state judiciary, including another case concerning a challenge to the constitutionality of the firearm owner ID card, expected to be heard by the Illinois Supreme Court next week. Now, that's the state courts. We have not seen any movement on challenges against Illinois' gun and magazine ban. You have the Veramontes case out of Cook County, which includes challenging the state's gun and magazine ban of semi-automatic firearms and magazines over certain capacities. Still in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Whether or not they're going to take that case has not been revealed. But then you've also got the Barnett case, which has a Southern District federal judge in Illinois determining that the state's ban is unconstitutional. That case has been heard by the appeals court, but that was back in September of 2025, and it's been months since gun owners have had any certainty on what's going to happen with that case. So still plenty more to come when it comes to litigation against Illinois gun regulations and whether or not those are constitutional. So that is Illinois in Focus here for the Center Square Daily. From my studio in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and join us back here Wednesday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from around the country, only with the Center Square Daily.